In 1965, the average American man could perform 14 different household repairs without calling anyone. Plumbing, electrical, carpentry, appliance repair. He learned most of them from his father before he turned 18. By 2005, that number had dropped to 3 repairs, and one of them was changing a light bulb. This didn't happen because men got dumber. It happened because between 1975 and 1995, a series of very specific decisions were made that guaranteed your son would never have what your father had. And those decisions weren't about safety. They were about profit. Here's exactly when they made sure this generation couldn't fix anything, and the 7 skills they deliberately took away. You remember what it was like watching your father work, the way he'd crouch down next to a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink, flashlight in one hand, wrench in the other, and just figure it out. No phone call, no appointment scheduled 3 weeks out, no service fee. He'd look at the problem, think about it for maybe 30 seconds, and then his hands would move. Tighten this, replace that, done. And you learned by watching. Not because he sat you down for a formal lesson, because you were there. You handed him the wrench, you held the flashlight. You saw how a house worked from the inside out. That wasn't special, that was normal. Every man you knew growing up could do the same thing. Your neighbor could rewire a lamp, your uncle could rebuild a toilet, your grandfather could patch a roof, reseat a window, and fix a furnace that wouldn't fire. None of them were professionals. They were just men who knew how their homes worked because someone had shown them. And then, somewhere between 1975 and 1995, all of that started to disappear. Not slowly, systematically. Let's start with the first skill they took. And this one set the template for everything that followed. Appliance repair. In 1970, when your refrigerator stopped cooling or your washing machine wouldn't spin, you didn't replace it, you fixed it. And you could fix it because appliances were built with access panels, standard parts, and repair manuals that came in the box. Sears sold repair kits at the hardware store. You could walk in, describe the problem, and walk out with the exact capacitor or belt you needed for $4. Your father kept a washing machine running for 15 years, not because he was frugal, because he could look at a machine, understand how it worked, and replace the part that failed. Then, in 1976, a federal trade regulation changed the warranty rules. Manufacturers were no longer required to make replacement parts available to consumers for a minimum of 7 years. That was the rule before, 7 years of part availability. It meant you could keep a machine running for a decade or more. When that requirement disappeared, so did the parts. By 1982, try finding a motor for a 6-year-old dryer. You couldn't. The parts weren't discontinued because machines got better. They were discontinued because selling you a new dryer was worth $400. Selling you a motor was worth $35. And the machines themselves changed. Diagnostic computers replaced mechanical timers. Sealed systems replaced accessible components. By 1990, even if you could find the part, you couldn't install it without a proprietary diagnostic tool that cost $200 and was only sold to authorized service centers. Your father fixed appliances because he could. Your son can't because they made sure he can't. But that was just the beginning. The second skill they removed was electrical work. And they didn't do it by making the work harder. They did it by making it illegal. Up until the mid-1970s, a homeowner could do his own electrical work in most of America. You pulled a permit, you did the work, an inspector came by and signed off on it. That was the system. It worked. Your grandfather added outlets, installed ceiling fans, ran new circuits to the garage. He didn't need a license. He needed to do it right. Then the National Electrical Code started adding complexity. Not for safety, for credentialing. In 1978, the NEC added arc fault circuit interrupter requirements. In 1981, ground fault interrupters became mandatory in more locations. In 1987, tamper-resistant receptacles. Each change added cost. Each change added liability. And each change gave local jurisdictions an excuse to require licensed electricians for work that hadn't changed in 50 years. By 1995, in most American cities, homeowner electrical work was functionally illegal. You could change a light switch, anything more, and you needed a licensed contractor. Not because you couldn't do it safely, because the licensing boards and the electrical contractors lobbied to make sure you'd have to call someone. A ceiling fan installation that your father did on a Saturday morning in 1972 for the cost of the fan now requires a service call that starts at $150 before the electrician even opens his truck. They didn't make the work safer, they made it inaccessible. Now here's where the timeline gets suspicious. The third skill was plumbing, and the same pattern repeats. In 1965, residential plumbing was galvanized steel, cast iron, and copper. You could cut it, thread it, sweat it, and join it with tools you already owned. A pipe wrench, a hacksaw, a propane torch. Your father replaced a corroded section of drain pipe in an afternoon. Then PVC arrived in the 1970s. And PVC was supposed to make plumbing easier, lighter, cheaper, simpler to work with. And for about 10 years it did. You could assemble an entire drain system with purple primer and glue. But then the codes changed. By 1983, most jurisdictions required licensed plumbers for any modification to drain, waste, and vent systems. The justification was safety. The reality was revenue. Plumbing permits went from $15 to $150. Inspections that used to be cursory became adversarial. And if you did the work yourself and the inspector didn't like your slope or your venting, you ripped it out and started over, or you paid the fine and hired someone with a license. By 1990, the same repair your father did for $12 in materials cost $450 in labor, plus materials, plus permit, plus inspection. And that's if you could even identify the problem. Because the fourth skill they took was diagnostic knowledge. Your grandfather didn't just fix things, he understood them. He knew what a furnace sounded like when the blower motor bearing was going. He knew what a failing water heater sounded like 3 weeks before it flooded the basement. He knew the smell of a gas leak, the sound of a pipe freezing, the feel of a breaker about to trip. He had that knowledge because he'd been inside those systems. He'd taken them apart, cleaned them, reassembled them. And the systems were simple enough that taking them apart made sense. But starting in the early 1980s, manufacturers began sealing everything. Your furnace became a black box with a computer board. Your water heater became a sealed unit with a non-replaceable thermostat. Your garbage disposal went from 4 bolts and a reset button to a riveted housing that couldn't be opened. You can't learn a system you can't see, and you can't fix what you can't learn. By 1995, the average American home had 14 sealed systems that required proprietary tools or specialized knowledge to service. In 1970, that number was 0. This wasn't about efficiency, it was about dependency. If you made it this far, you already understand something most people never will about what this country used to be. You understand that competence was normal, that self-reliance wasn't a hobby, it was just how men lived. And you're about to see how they made sure that stopped. The fifth skill they eliminated was small engine repair. And this one hits hard because this is the one they actively removed from the next generation. In 1975, every high school in America with a shop program taught small engine repair. Lawnmowers, chainsaws, tillers. Boys learned how a 2-stroke engine worked. They learned carburation, ignition timing, compression. They rebuilt engines in class and took them home and used them. Then between 1985 and 1995, shop classes were cut from 87% of American high schools. Not reduced, eliminated. The justification was budget cuts and college prep. The reality was that schools were being pushed towards standardized testing, and classes that didn't boost test scores were expendable. But here's the thing. Those skills didn't just teach you how to fix a lawnmower. They taught you how systems work, how fuel and air and spark create power, how to diagnose a problem by listening, by testing, by thinking. A boy who learned to rebuild a carburetor in 1975 grew up into a man who could look at a problem and figure it out. A boy who never saw the inside of an engine in 1995 grew up into a man who Googles, "Why won't my mower start?" and then pays someone $90 to clean a spark plug. They didn't just take the skill, they took the confidence that comes from understanding how things work. And if you ever watched your father do this next one, you're going to feel something right now. The sixth skill was carpentry and structural repair. Your father could replace a rotted sill plate. He could sister a cracked floor joist. He could rebuild a set of porch stairs that had weathered for 30 years. Not because he was a carpenter, because he'd watched his father do it and because wood is wood. But in 1985, the International Residential Code began requiring engineered lumber for structural applications. Laminated veneer lumber, I-joists, oriented strand board, materials that required specific fasteners, specific installation techniques, and specific manufacturer certifications. A repair that used to require a 2x10 and a handful of nails now required an engineer's stamp and a contractor's license. And the building departments enforced it. Pull a permit to replace a deck, and suddenly you needed frost depth footings, galvanized joist hangers, and a sealed drawing. The same deck your father built in 1968 with a shovel, a saw, and a level. They turned simple work into specialist work, and they did it on purpose. The seventh skill, the one that ties everything together, general maintenance knowledge. Your grandfather walked through his house every season and knew what to check. Gutters in the fall, caulking in the spring, grease the garage door chain, oil the furnace blower, tighten the packing nut on a dripping faucet, bleed the radiators, check the sump pump. He knew these things because he'd been taught that a house requires attention, that small problems caught early don't become big problems later, that 15 minutes of prevention saves $1,500 of repair. But when you can't fix anything yourself, you stop learning what to look for. When every repair requires a specialist, you stop thinking of your house as a system you maintain and start thinking of it as a product you consume. And that shift is what they wanted. Because your grandfather didn't fix the sink because he enjoyed plumbing. He fixed it because his family needed water. And he was the man in that house, and that meant the problem was his to solve. He didn't read a manual. He didn't watch a tutorial. He looked at the problem, he thought about it, and he fixed it. Because that's what the men in his life had taught him to do. And that chain, father to son, Hands on the same wrench. That chain held for centuries. It didn't break on its own. Someone cut it. They cut it with code, changes that required licenses for work that hadn't changed in 50 years. They cut it with sealed systems and proprietary tools. They cut it with liability laws and insurance requirements. They cut it by removing shop classes from schools. They cut it by designing products that couldn't be repaired. They cut it by making the simple complicated and the accessible illegal. And they did it because a man who can fix his own home doesn't call a repairman, doesn't buy a new appliance every 6 years, doesn't pay $50 service fees, doesn't generate revenue. Self-reliance is bad for business. But here's what they didn't count on. These skills aren't dead. They're sleeping. And every man watching this video just proved that someone still remembers. You remember what it meant to be competent, to be the person your family counted on when something broke, to look at a problem and know you could solve it. You can't bring back shop class. You can't rewrite the building codes. You can't force manufacturers to make repairable products. But you can bring your grandson into the garage this Saturday. You can show him how a faucet works, how to use a voltage tester, how to read a tape measure, how to think through a problem instead of Googling the answer. You're the last generation that learned these skills as a birthright instead of a hobby. That makes you the last line. And that matters more than you know. If this hit home, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because there are a lot more skills they don't want remembered.